Oh, I didn't see you there. Glad you could join me. Welcome back to another cozy Christmas horror with me, Dr. Plague. Looks like you've caught me decking the halls, I suppose, putting up a few lights and setting out the decorative Santas and the candles and things. Something about decorating and putting out the nativity scene and putting out all the festive Santas and the sights and smells of the holidays. It really just gets me in the mood for Christmas. It's no secret on this channel that I'm a Halloween man. Always have been. Halloween is big business in this household. But something about Christmas, I don't know. It's just a time that reminds me of my childhood. And that's always important to me. The people we meet around this time of year, the people we reconnect with, the people we remember because they're no longer with us. Don't mind me, I'm getting sentimental. Let me break out the Keurig and get some hot chocolate together, and we'll listen to some wonderful, well, some cozy, cold, frightening even, Christmas horror. With me, Dr. Plague, of course. Have any of you guys ever built a snowman? I know I have. Not here in Florida. Florida was never really made for snowmen. That was always something I did back in Georgia. Something I miss a lot. I always joke that Georgia has these things that we don't know anything about in Florida. These whatchamacallums. Oh, yeah, seasons, other than hot or slightly less hot. But, I'm getting off track. Snowmen are as much a part of the holidays as Christmas trees are sometimes. And we always wish that our snowy companions could hang around for another year. But that is the nature of snow, as it melts. But while they're here, perhaps your new friend will protect you from the ills of this world, especially if you found your own White Knight. It seemed like every year Kyle looked forward to the snow. Living in North Georgia, he usually found his front yard full of the stuff sometime around Thanksgiving. Kyle fondly remembered the year a blizzard blew in before Halloween, and they had to trick-or-treat in the snow. Kyle's Batman costume quickly got upgraded with a puffy jacket and some ski boots with snowshoes as he became some obscure Batman that his mom had found on one of those little toy checklists he had pinned to his wall. Kyle loved the snow and would spend hours playing outside, making forts and having snowball fights with his friends. He only really came in if his parents made him, and only then until he warmed up enough to go back out. Kyle's favorite thing of all was building the large, lumpy snowmen that seemed to be all children could manage in their chunky gloves with their limited motor skills. After the first snow of the season, his yard always seemed to be full of snowmen. Sometimes Kyle stuck plastic guns or swords in their stick hands and decorated them with plastic dollar store armor to make them knights, or cast them in green clothes to make them soldiers. His dad used to take pictures of them and send them to magazines for local color pieces, and Kyle couldn't remember a year that at least one of them didn't make it somewhere in the paper. Many of them also hung around the house. When he grew up, Kyle still found that he loved the snow, but he never built snowmen. All the magic was sapped out of it when he was 10. Kyle, Carl, and Reggie were building an army of snowmen in the front yard when Terry and his friends came to call. Kyle's mom had been to Habitat for Humanity and brought home a big cardboard box full of plastic swords, helmets, and breastplates. There were probably about 24 sets in the box, a birthday party idea that someone had grown tired of, and Kyle and his friends were setting about making snow knights. They kept a set of armor apiece for themselves, and once the knights were built, they would have fun pretending to be warriors and knocking them down. They had just set them all up and were slinging on their gear when Terry came down the road with his 3 friends. Terry, Bobby, Mark, and Dale went to school with them, and they were all kind of bullies. Of the 4, Terry was the worst, and Kyle suspected that the others wouldn't be such big jerks if it hadn't been for Terry. Kyle and his friends had, in fact, partnered with the other three for school projects, and found them pretty friendly when they were separated from Terry. Terry was just a mean kid. He was that kid from your childhood you just remember being unpleasant. His dad was the town dog catcher, and Terry could regularly be seen tormenting some of the ones he brought home. There were rumors that he'd killed a few of them, and if his treatment of Kyle and his friends were any indication, they believed it. The four rode up on their bikes, taking advantage of the freshly plowed road and leering at the boys' game. "Ooh, what you doing, sissies? Gonna play some make-believe?" Terry said, using his mocking tone. Carl and Reggie looked a little embarrassed, aware that what they were doing was a little babyish. But Kyle stood his ground and refused to be turned aside from his fun. "None of your business, Terry. Why don't you take your bike and get the heck out of here?" Terry grinned. "Who's gonna stop me if I don't, Gaylord? You gonna tell your mommy?" Kyle brandished his little plastic sword and drew himself up with all the bearing a 10-year-old could manage. "Don't you dare take one step into my yard, Terry, or I swear to God I'll beat the crap out of you." Reggie and Carl gave him a sidelong look, clearly not wanting to fight with Terry or his friends. As Terry let his bike fall to the pavement and took those first steps onto the snowy lawn, Kyle saw Reggie break for the house. He was saying something about telling Kyle's mom, but Carl just stood there, unsure whether to join him or not. Terry and his friends crunched through the fresh powder, not unsure about much of anything. Unfortunately, Terry wasn't one of those bullies that couldn't back up his threats. He was about a head taller than Kyle, and outweighed him by about 50 pounds. It wasn't fat either. Terry's dad expected chores to be done, and work to be completed after school, and Terry had a lot of muscle to back up his threats. When Kyle swung his lame little sword at him, Terry stepped aside and swung at him with a closed fist. Kyle stumbled sloppily aside, and Terry smacked against one of the snowmen instead, sending a big chunk of its body crumbling to the ground. Terry sucked in air and shook his ungloved hand, the cold snow stinging his skin. Kyle could see little drops of red where he had struck a pine cone or a rock in the snow. Kyle swung down then, hitting Terry's arm with the plastic blade and eliciting a little yap of pain and surprise from the bully. Kyle took a defensive stance, now a little more sure of himself, but it was already too late. Terry turned and socked him right in the nose with a right hook. Kyle stumbled backwards, seeing stars as he fell, crunching into the snow as Terry towered over him. "Well, go on then. Beat the crap out of me." Kyle didn't immediately get up. His nose was bleeding, and his head was foggy. 3 Terrys shifted slowly before his eyes, and as they walked closer, he tried to lift his arms in defense. He lay in the snow, the moisture creeping into the seat of his snow pants, and suddenly felt a cold glob of something hit him in the face. He pulled a shaky hand up and realized that Terry had spit on him. Pathetic. "Push some of these snowmen over, fellas. Let's teach him not to mess with us." His friends, who'd been standing around looking uncomfortable, moved to do something that wouldn't get them in as much trouble as fighting. The snowman that had saved Kyle from Terry's first blow fell over wetly, the hard-packed snow needing very little convincing to rejoin the drift on the ground. Terry and his friends had pushed about 9 or 10 of the Snow Legion when Kyle heard his mom yelling from the porch. She was telling them to get the hell out of here as she crunched into the snow to see what had happened. Terry and his gang were away then, kicking over a few more snowmen in passing before jumping on their bikes and speeding away. Kyle's mom helped him up and brought the 3 boys inside so they could check Kyle's nose. After deciding that it wasn't broken, she gave them all hot cocoa as she tried to call Kyle's dad. She hung up with a disgusted head shake, telling Kyle to keep pinching his nose as he tried not to burn himself with the hot liquid. She said that she would have his father talk to Terry's father when he got home this evening, but all of them knew that that was a wasted effort. Terry's dad didn't care what his son did, and was the only person in town who was meaner than Terry. The snow had closed the schools early this year, so Terry would likely be back to stir up more trouble tomorrow. Kyle figured he'd just have to deal with it, but he wouldn't likely try to stand up to Terry again. Carl and Reggie made excuses to leave after that. Suddenly, the idea of playing in the yard didn't seem to appeal to them, and they left the armor behind as they walked back to their houses. Kyle told them that he'd see them tomorrow, but by the way they said they'd see, he didn't think he would. They'd been shamed and scared off by Terry, and Kyle doubted that they would be back to play until they all went back to school. He turned to see how many snowmen he had left, and was determined to replace the ones that Terry and his friends had knocked down. To his annoyance, Kyle found that only 4 had survived the attack, and one of them appeared to be the one that had bloodied Terry's knuckles. A chunk was missing, and the snow was stained a little pink where Terry had hit it, but it was still upright. Kyle packed the wound and gave the snowman a smile as he looked up into its lumpy features made out of rocks from the driveway. "Thanks, buddy. Guess you're my knight in shining armor, huh?" The snowman didn't respond, but Kyle hadn't really expected him to. He had rebuilt most of them when his dad got home, and he sighed as he looked at Kyle's face. Terry again? Terry had been picking on the kids who lived in the neighborhood since he was old enough to walk, and if you looked like someone had beaten the crap out of you, then it was probably Terry's doing. His dad said that he'd call Mr. Maslow, the roads being a little too rough to drive right now, and Kyle thanked him before returning to repairing his snow army as Dad went in to make the call. By the time the sun set, Kyle had about 30 snow knights ready for the battle the next day, and couldn't wait for tomorrow morning. When he came inside, he could hear his dad trying to talk to Terry's dad, and he winced as he pulled the phone away in the face of the yelling on the other end. Kyle took his place at the table, and a few minutes later, his dad joined them, still grumbling about the rude neighbors. His mom smiled at him and kissed his dad on the forehead, doling out a little extra roast for dealing with that old dragon. When Kyle went to bed that night, the snow flurries were falling outside the window, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be another snowy day to play in the fresh powder made him eager for the dawn. Kyle was up bright and early the next day to play in the snow. The armored snowmen were enemy soldiers, their leader wearing a solid black breastplate and sporting a stick mustache. All the snowmen, except for the one that had taken a punch for him yesterday. Kyle had decided that the snowman would assist him in battle, and they cut the other snow knights to pieces as they saved the snow prince from their evil leader. The snow knight didn't really help, of course. He watched Kyle's back as he hacked and slashed through the opposition, his own sword held firmly in hand. Kyle watched them fall to pieces with relish, his face red as his breath steamed in the cold air. Kyle was having too much fun to think about Terry that morning, and the bully didn't poke his head up to bother him until after lunch. Kyle had come outside after soup and sandwiches to find a new army of snowmen had been erected to stand against him and his friend. Kyle smiled, confused, but more pleasantly surprised than anything. He didn't question the appearance of the new snowmen. Maybe his dad had come home and decided to leave a little surprise for him. Kyle set about building an extra large snowman to be their evil leader, making him a set of bulbous arms and giving him some missing teeth from the driveway gravel. He was just carving the snow helmet with the tip of his sword, his breastplate looking large and sturdy with the sticks he'd added, when he heard the sound of rubber on concrete. Kyle tried to ignore it. Maybe it wasn't the sound of Terry's roadmaster as it turned the corner, but all illusions were shattered a moment later when Kyle heard the boy's standard greeting. "Hey, you gay lord, playin' in the snow again?" he said in a fake baby talk way he liked to use. Kyle heard his friends laugh behind him as he said it, but he didn't turn around. If Terry wanted to beat him up, he'd have to do it in his yard and come trespassing. "What do you want, Terry?" Kyle asked, his nose still sore from the day before. "Just thought you'd like to know I got grounded for punching you in your stupid face yesterday." That surprised Kyle. He hadn't expected Terry's dad to do anything more than yell at him. The fact that he'd taken the time to tell Terry he was grounded was sort of refreshing. Clearly it hadn't worked, but hey, it was progress. "Good to know. So why are you here?" "We're looking for Dale," Bobby said, his voice sounding a little upset, despite Terry's angry look. "His mom said he never came home yesterday, and we were thinking—" "No, I haven't seen him either," Kyle assured him. "If I do, though, I'll point him home." "Whatever," Terry scoffed, and the three of them rode off on their bikes, cutting noisily up the snowy road. Kyle went back to building his snow knights, oblivious to the context of what was happening around him. That was how it had began. For the next week, Kyle played pretend in the yard. He saw the snowmen rise and fall, but the one that had pricked Terry remained standing. He was the colonel of the boys' army, the knight captain of his crusaders, the king of the kingdom, and any other leader Kyle needed. This didn't seem weird to Kyle at the time. He was just a kid and figured the snowman would be gone once the snow melted. They played every day, Carl and Reggie seeming to have lost their appetite for the snow, which was fine as long as Kyle didn't think about it. Who needed them anyway? Kyle had friends at hand any time he built them. They searched for Dale for quite a while. His parents were worried that he'd been picked up by some kind of sex pervert or something. They never found his bike either, and the longer he remained missing, the more the police figured they would find him when the snow melted. Kyle's dad figured that he'd likely taken one of the curves on the mountain a little too sharply and slid under the guardrail. If Terry didn't push him off the cliff somewhere, he added, earning a smack from Kyle's mom and a quick glance at their son. Kyle agreed, but he pretended not to have heard, since it seemed his mother didn't want him to get ideas. When Kyle went out the next day, he was surprised to see that the snowman was gone. It wasn't terribly upsetting. Snowmen melted, but Kyle had become quite attached to the fella. He had left the snow soldiers in the yard, guns and helmets dotting them, and it seemed like only the old snowman was gone. Kyle started to rebuild him, but decided instead to go see his friends. Carl had called to ask if he wanted to come play Super Nintendo at his house, and Kyle thought it might be nice to do something a little different. As he rode his bike, he rubbed his hands as the wind cut across him. Carl lived a little higher up on the mountain than he did, and as he passed the houses along the way, he couldn't help but notice the undisturbed snow in their yards. Kyle couldn't understand how anyone, adult or child, could look at all that snow and not feel moved to be out in it. As they cruised past Bobby's house, however, he could see that his yard had sprouted a couple of snowmen. Kyle wondered why he had helped Terry give him so much flack if he was fond of snowman building too, but he couldn't help but notice that Bobby's snowmen looked a little different. They were arrayed outside the house's windows, almost like they were peeking in, and it was a little spooky looking. Kyle put on a burst of speed, feeling a little weird about seeing it, like it was him peeking in instead of a bunch of snowmen. He pulled up in front of Carl's house and saw that Reggie's bike was already there. The two were sitting in his bedroom playing Goof Troop on the Super NES, and they waved at Kyle as he came in. Carl's dad was the superintendent for the school system in the area, and Carl had all kinds of cool stuff at his house. Reggie said he'd swap with Kyle when he died, and the three boys sat around and thwarted the efforts of Pirate Pete as they made their way through the levels. "Has Terry been bothering you lately?" Reggie asked, kicking a block into one of the fat pirates as he blocked their path. "Not really. I think his dad got mad when my dad called," Kyle said, spinning a Rubik's Cube in his hand half-heartedly. "Did you hear about Dale?" Carl asked quietly, as if he was afraid to talk too loudly about it. "Just that he's missing. Dad said they found his bike in a snowdrift. Said something had hit it hard enough to dent the front wheel." Did they find Dale?" Kyle asked, curious as to why he hadn't heard about the boy being found. "Nope, he's still missing. Sheriff Draper came to check the area, though. They think he might have fallen off when he hit whatever he hit. Dad thinks he might have been snatched." Kyle thought about this as they played, and as the sun started going down, he opted to head out before it got too dark. Carl's mom asked if he'd like to stay for dinner, but Kyle said that he had to get home or his mother would worry. He shivered as he climbed onto his bike, taking off as the cold air gave him a burst of speed. As he drove past Bobby's house, he saw that the snowmen were gone, and he wondered if Bobby had been the one to build them or not. When he pulled up in his own yard, Kyle was surprised to see that his snowman was back, right in the same spot it had been before. He was still wearing the breastplate that Kyle had put on him in the first place, but someone had replaced his plastic sword with a machete. His dad was probably having a goof. He had drawn his smile a little creepier than Kyle remembered it too, and as he walked up, he patted the snowman on the shoulder. "Good to have you back, partner." The body was rounder than it had ever been, but not quite round enough to hide something gray in the middle. Kyle pushed away a bit of snow and found a big rock in the center of the snowman's body. Kyle thought that was weird, but maybe Dad was trying to stop Terry and his friends from wrecking him up again. He went inside as the moon cast the yard in diamonds, but that night he had a terrible dream about his friend. He was sitting in the yard, flanked by a pair of snowmen who seemed to be leaking red stuff. Kyle wasn't sure if it was blood, but he was pretty sure it wasn't strawberry jelly. They were looking through his window, their coal eyes seeming very expressive, and when Kyle turned away, he could see their shadows growing tall on the wall. He peeked under the covers, looking through a slit in his comforter, and could see the heads of the two snowmen melting to reveal a pair of skulls with empty eye sockets. Kyle woke up with a start, but found his window empty. The next day, Kyle was playing in the yard when he heard Terry shout at him from the road. "Stay the hell out of my yard, Gaylord!" Kyle jumped and turned to look at him, startled by the sudden appearance. He hadn't heard the bike at all, and Terry usually came in loudly. He was alone today, none of his cronies having made the trip, and Kyle thought back to Bobby's yard the day before. Had he decided not to play with Terry after his behavior? Kyle doubted it, but it was possible. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, legitimately confused. He'd been here all morning, building snow knights for another battle, and his hands were wet and wrinkly under his gloves. He'd been planning on making another army to conquer, having found a plastic axe in his toy chest, and he was going to pretend to be Conan as he conquered the savage army. He was almost finished with a giant fella, the leader of this band of cannibals, when Terry had startled him. "Stop building snowmen in my yard," Terry repeated, letting his bike fall to the icy pavement as he took a step towards Kyle. "I know it's you. You're the only baby stupid enough to build these things. If I wake up one more night to find them peeking in my window, I'm going to pound you," he said, shaking his fist at Kyle. He didn't seem to want to step into his yard, though, and the threat was sort of lame. Kyle ignored him, continuing to build his snow giant, and Terry eventually left. That night, his dad told him that Bobby had gone missing, too. "Strangest thing," he said, pouring gravy on his roast. "His folks said he went to take the trash out the day before and just never came back. They thought he'd gone to see Terry or Mark, but they started hunting for him, and he didn't come back. The sheriff's pretty worried about it. The people are gonna want answers soon, and we're only a 3-officer town. There's no footprints either. Odd, since there's been no snow today. But there were some strange marks they'd thought might be tire tracks. Poor kid. Hopefully they find him." Kyle didn't eat much, wondering if he'd seen the vehicle that had taken Bobby. He didn't think he'd seen any cars that day, none that high up the mountain, and he hadn't passed any strange vehicles yesterday on his way back from Carl's house. He thought again about the snowman, but put it out of his head. Snowmen couldn't hurt anybody. They were just snow. The next day, Kyle saw a familiar truck pulling into the driveway. He was pulling his boots on, getting ready to go play after lunch, but he went back inside as a haggard bear of a man climbed out and walked towards the house. His dad was getting ready for work, the shifts having changed a little when the second kid went missing, and as Kyle came blundering into the kitchen, he narrowed his eyes at the door. He answered the angry knock and came eye to eye with Terry's father, Herschel Maslow. Herschel looked angry, angrier than Kyle had ever seen him. He staggered a little, likely drunk, but his eyes were bloodshot and angry. As the town dog catcher, he was supposed to stay sober while on the job, but that hardly seemed to matter to him. The mayor, his first cousin, usually smoothed over any problems he found with the police, but Herschel was a bomb just waiting to go off. He steadied himself against the doorframe before slurring out, "Keep your stupid brat off my property. I'm tired of hearing my boy whine about these damn snowmen." His dad looked at Kyle, but Kyle just shook his head. "Kyle, have you left the yard today?" Kyle shook his head again, but Herschel scoffed. "He's lying. I found 5 of them snowmen in my yard this morning. They just keep popping up, and Terry don't make 'em. Tell your kid to stay out of my yard, cop, else I'll shoot him as a trespasser next I see him." His dad looked like he meant to say more to Herschel, but the man stumbled off then, climbing into his truck as Kyle and his dad watched him go. Drunk bastard. Should pull him over right now. He looked down at Kyle for a moment before growling, "Make sure you stay away from the Maslow house, kiddo. He's a mean old drunk, but I think enough kids have gone missing so far without you getting shot for riding your bike." Kyle said he would, not intending to go anywhere close to that farm. The snowman was gone again when he came out to play, and Kyle wondered if Mr. Maslow had knocked him over. Kyle played in the snow for the rest of the afternoon, and as the sun began to sink towards dark, he heard a familiar squeal of tires. He started to head inside, not really wanting to be harassed by Terry today, but when someone called to him, he saw that it was Mark instead of the unpleasant young man. He pulled up in the yard, out of breath, sweat standing out on his forehead. "Hey, Kyle," he said, looking around fretfully. "Still, playing in the snow, huh?" Kyle nodded, looking behind him as though he expected to see Terry coming up on his bike, too. Could I ask a favor?" he said, looking behind him as if he thought something was following him. "I guess," Kyle said, looking to see what was chasing him. Terry's dad wasn't home, and Terry wouldn't ride with me to my house. Would you..." He looked torn, as if asking would make him feel weak. "Could you ride with me to my house? I hate to ask, but I feel kind of nervous about riding alone." Kyle thought about telling him to buzz off, but Mark seemed really shaken. He thought about it and figured that maybe Mark wouldn't mess with him if he owed him a favor. Besides, he could always ask Carl's mom if she could give him a ride, their house being just a few houses from Mark's. She would gladly drive him home, it being close to dark, and Kyle nodded, sticking his head in to tell his mom he was going to ride up to Carl's for a second. "Okay," he said, hopping on his own bike, "but let's be quick. It's almost dark." As the two took off, Mark seemed even more rattled than before. He kept looking behind them as they rode, and Kyle couldn't help but look as well. As the shadows gathered on the mountain, Kyle thought he heard something crunching in the snow behind them. He never got a good look at it, though. It moved quickly through the trees, its form hunched as it churned up the snow. Mark's teeth clicked together a little as he put on a burst of speed. "Something's following us," Kyle whispered, matching his speed. Mark didn't say anything. The two zipped up the mountain, and the edge yawned hugely beside them. This was the precipice, one of the edges that could send you tumbling off the side if you weren't careful, and the icy road made him wonder if he could stop in time if it came to it. It shrank away suddenly, and a few houses dotted the side, their windows lit with soft inner light. Kyle could still see the shadows following them, the three figures keeping up with them quickly, and when they rounded the next bend, Kyle stopped in confusion. It was his snowman, the one with the black breastplate, but the other two he didn't seem to recognize. They stood in the road, blocking the path, and the kids would be forced to ride between them to get farther up. Kyle had few qualms about moving between them, but Mark started to shake and mumble as he watched the three. No, not again. I'm not going out like that. Not like Bobby." He turned into the trees to their left and plunged in like a frightened deer. Kyle started to ask him what was wrong, but that's when he heard something grind against the pavement in front of him. It sounded like ice under someone's tires, and he turned back in time to see that the snowmen were gone. In the dying light, he thought he saw them disappear into the trees, and without thinking, Kyle plunged in after Mark. The boy's trail was easy to follow. The broken branches and tire tracks led him into the snow-covered woods. It was good that he had a trail to follow, otherwise he would have joined Mark at the bottom of the small holler. He had gone right over the edge in his haste, and he and his bike were at the bottom, lying in a heap. Kyle came down carefully, trying not to join him at the bottom, but when he got to him, he could tell the boy's arm was broken. "Can you move?" Kyle whispered, not sure why he was trying to be quiet. Mark groaned, sitting up as he hissed and pulled his arm in close. Around the holler, Kyle could hear something moving roughly through the snow. It churned it up, moving lumpily through the shadows, and as the boys huddled in the cup of the valley, the setting sun left them in twilight. Kyle tried to get an arm under him, wanting to help Mark out of the dell, but the boy pulled away, shaking his head as he touched his chest. "I think I broke something in the fall. My chest is on fire. My arm hurts too much." Kyle licked his lips, unable to figure out what to do. "What did you mean you weren't going out like Bobby?" he asked, looking around at the hunkered shadows that peeked in on them. "Bobby called me the day before he disappeared," he groaned, sitting down in the snow and scrunching his eyes shut. He said he'd been seeing snowmen hanging around his house and was a little scared. We thought you were doing it, but the snowmen seemed to be moving, and he begged me to come over and make sure he wasn't going crazy. I would have too, but my mom didn't want me going out so close to dark. Then Bobby was gone. Kyle couldn't imagine that the snowmen were actually snatching kids, but the longer he watched them shuffle around the outside of the holler, the more he began to believe that something was going on. If I can't get you out, then I'll go get you help, Kyle said, Mark groaning in protest almost at once. Carl's house is right around the bend. If I can make it there quick, I can get you some help. I'll be right back. Just fend them off till then. It was a bad plan, but Kyle didn't really know what else to do. They would get both of them otherwise, and as Mark tried to stop him from going, he took off up the side of the bowl at a run. He expected roots to snag his feet or limbs to grab him as he ran, but nothing stood in his path. He kind of thought that the thing that had stalked them would come after him, but they never seemed to come after him. His fear of them seemed to be his only enemy, and as the trees pressed in around him, the sun plunged him into near total darkness. The silvery moon overhead provided little in the way of light, and as he ran, Kyle felt himself becoming hopelessly lost. It should have been easy to find his way out of the woods. They weren't very large, but it wasn't until Kyle saw a jumble of confusing lights that he finally found his way out of the trees. It was the bubble lights on his dad's police cruiser, and when he saw him, he pulled him in close, and Kyle could feel the tears as they soaked into his shoulders. I thought someone had gotten you. I thought for sure I'd never see you again. Kyle tried to tell him what had happened, but his dad was squeezing him too tightly for much beyond a few squeaks. When he finally stopped squeezing him, Kyle told him about Mark and the shapes in the woods. Get in the car, he said, putting Kyle in the back seat as he got on the radio and called for help. He clearly didn't believe that the snowmen had done this, but he believed that something was out there, and that it intended to take children. Despite the weather, 3 other squad cars soon came flashing up the mountain, and the sheriff had his dog in the back seat. Stay here, his dad said. You'll be safe in the back. We're going to see if we can find Mark. Kyle pushed his face against the window, watching them disappear into the trees. As he watched, his adrenaline spiking, he felt his eyes getting heavier and heavier. He fell asleep with his head against the door, and when the car rumbled to life sometime later, Kyle shook awake. His dad was driving, and another car was behind him as they went down the mountain. Where are we going? Kyle asked. His dad started as he seemed to realize that his son was still in the back seat. He seemed to be looking for the words, gonna take the murderer into custody. Kyle felt his blood run cold. Murderer? Had Mark been killed too? What did his dad mean? As they drove down the mountain, passing their own house, Kyle asked if they had found Mark. No, he said, strangely solemn, but we found drag marks. They went all the way down to, well, he seemed not to want to tell Kyle, but as they pulled into the Maslow property, he didn't have a lot of choice. We found him inside a snowman. Kyle heard someone shout and saw a very puffy-eyed Mr. Maslow as he was led away from his home in handcuffs. The sheriff and Deputy Frank were having trouble with him, but they were half tugging, half carrying him as he went towards the deputy's car, the sheriff's dog baying wildly in the back of his cruiser. Terry was being led away by Deputy Martin, and though uncuffed, he looked scared. As they pulled away, the sheriff told Kyle's dad to wait for the coroner so someone could get the bodies. Kyle's dad keyed up the mic and said that he would. They were inside the snowmen. There were 4 of them, one of them having only a rock inside. We don't know if it was Terry or Herschel, but one of them built those snowmen around those kids' bodies. I'm just glad we found you in time. His dad started to get out, but Kyle needed him to answer the question. What did the one with the rock in him look like? His dad, thinking he understood, nodded. It was wearing that black breastplate your snowman in the front yard was wearing. I think he might have been saving that one for you, but I'm not sure. The coroner pulled up then, and Dad climbed out. Kyle looked out the window. seeing the 3 destroyed snowmen, but he felt the gravel eyes of the 4th as it took him in. Kyle never forgot that winter. Mr. Maslow was sent to prison for murder, his cousin unable to smooth this over. Terry went to stay with relatives and was never seen on the mountain again. The house was put up for sale, but no one seemed to want it. When the snow caved the roof in 3 years later, they just destroyed it, and the property was still empty to Kyle's knowledge. Kyle moved to Boston after college, leaving behind the mountains and the harsh winters. He still enjoyed the snow, loving the way it piled in the yard as it fell, but he never played in it. Sometimes he thought he saw a battered old snowman in a black breastplate standing watch in his yard, but he never caught more than a glimpse of it. Kyle never thought much of it. Surely it couldn't be the same one. That had been years and years ago, and snowmen just didn't last that long. He went right on thinking that, until a coworker who fancied himself a bit of a bully suddenly went missing. They found him in a snowdrift during spring, and Kyle always wondered if he was to blame for the man's death. When the pandemic started, Kyle was glad to be able to work from home. He didn't want to risk another life at the hands of his white knight. Hope that's not too hot for you. I just pulled it off the Keurig, and it's got, of course, the perfect alignment of marshmallows, so don't worry, I got you covered. It's without a doubt, and I feel no hyperbole saying it, but Sweden has some of the best holiday traditions. Some of you will remember the Yule Lad story that I did a few years ago, but there's another Christmas critter that doesn't often get enough talk. Speaking, of course, of the subject of our next story, a certain feline that might come and gobble you up if you haven't gotten some clothes for Christmas. So, be sure to get your kids a new warm Christmas sweater and avoid the notice of the Yule Cat. They say it's a legend, just a story we tell kids, but I'm here to tell you not to believe a word of it. You would do well to beware the Yule Cat, no matter what they say. My cousins and I grew up in the Icelandic countryside and spent most of our lives within a stone's throw of our birthplace. For 2 weeks in December, my saintly grandmother would welcome us into her home so my parents could go Christmas shopping or have some time to themselves. She had all my cousins as well, a brood of 8 when we were all assembled, and we made quite a houseful. Many nights after Granddad had made his excuses for going off to the pub, Grandma would gather us around the fire and tell us stories. Stories about fairies and Queen Mab and her ilk, and of the elves and darker things that had once been part of this landscape. She told us stories of Icelandic heroes, and filled our dreams with monsters that begged to be slain as we took on our favorite champion's role. But especially around the Christmas season, her favorite story was of the Yule Cat. He is a giant creature, capable of stepping over palisades and creeping into tall buildings. He punishes the lazy and rewards those who work hard and do their work year-round. If you neglect your duties, the Jorlakaturinn will find your children. Never doubt. His favorite meal is children without new clothes in the winter, their parents having spent their summers at leisure. Thankless children he hates as well, those who scorn their parents' work in favor of frivolous things. So be thankful, my children, that your parents work hard to keep such dark things away. Most of her stories about the Yule Cat involved naughty children who went into the woods at night, spoiled children whose parents found that the Yule Cat had dragged them out through their window and gobbled them up, and good children who were rushing home on Christmas Eve to get their clothes before the Yule Cat got them. My little brother Sven always held a deep fear of the Yule Cat, but I can honestly never remember a time when I was afraid of him. It always just seemed kind of goofy to me. And in my head, I just imagined a giant cat with big wobbly legs that looked like big noodles. Its body was high in the air, and the legs just wiggled around beneath it. I had drawn a picture of it for my grandma once, and she only smiled and ruffled my hair. Let us hope that if your Jorlakaturinn finds you, he is as silly as you think he is. I had smiled about the idea of meeting the Yule Cat then, thinking of all the monsters and beasts my cousin and I had slain in our dreams. I'm not smiling as I write this, though. I came to live with my grandparents when I was 15. My father and mother had been killed in a car accident when a semi slid on the ice and hit them head on. They say they died instantly, but all I knew was that Sven and I were suddenly without parents. There was never any question of where we would go, of course. My grandmother opened her home to us without a second thought. With Grandpa 3 years in his grave, she said it would be nice to have some company, and we moved into her earthy little cottage. I lived with her until I was 23, attending university and getting my degree so I could begin a career in architecture. After graduation, I took up residence in my parents' old home so that I could maintain the family homestead. The house was on my grandparents' land, so it wasn't as though I never saw her again. Sven didn't like to go back to the old house, claiming that there were too many memories there, and my grandmother sheltered him quite a bit. When I moved back, I invited him to come live with me, but he declined. He was 17 and showed none of my ambition. I was worried that if he stayed, my grandmother would coddle him forever, but that was his decision to make. I moved back in around Christmas time, and I decorated my old house like it was my first Christmas ever. The lights and decorations were still in the crawl space, like they had always been, and as I put them up, I began to feel a heady sense of nostalgia. The tree stood in full view of the window, and I had bought enough presents for everyone this year. I had spent much of my life not having a lot of money, and now that I had a lucrative job, I decided to take advantage of the holiday season and spoil my relatives a bit. When I was done, my house had shone out against the darkness like a beacon. I was sitting snug by the fire, a cup of spiced hot chocolate in my hand and a slight buzz making my mind slippery, when the phone rang. My grandma's smiling picture showed from the home screen, and I picked it up as I tried to compose my voice. Grandma was used to people being a little drunk, but Granddad had been pickled more than he was sober during life, and I was still at that age where I was self-conscious about her seeing me like that. I answered the phone, and she immediately started with no greeting. "Care, you haven't come to get your Yule clothes. You need to come back now." I wasn't used to my grandma being so forceful. She was usually very mild, content to smile and let others do what they would, but she seemed upset about this in an irrational way. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. All my cousins and my family and everyone would gather for presents at Grandma's before the usual feast. What Grandma was referring to was her tradition of giving us clothes to keep the Yule Cat away. This was my first Christmas away from home. I usually got them from Grandma when I woke up on the 23rd, but I guess I had missed it since I'd moved out. "Oh, that's okay, Gran. I'll just get them tomorrow. I'll be there with the others. You can give them to me." "No, you have to come get them now, and hurry. I need you here before the sun goes down, or the Yule Cat will get you." I had rolled my eyes at this. "Gran, I think the Yule Cat will understand if I don't want to go out in the snow and get clothes. Can't I just get them tomorrow?" Her voice went from severe matriarch to pleading older woman in the blink of an eye. "Care, please. It's your first time away from home, and I want you to be safe. I can leave them on the porch if you don't want to come inside, but please come and get them." She sounded scared, and I couldn't argue. I told her I would get dressed and drive over before sunset, and she sighed in relief and thanked me. I dressed warmly in my snow pants and heavy coat. My muffler and gloves came on next, along with a pair of snow boots and a flashlight just in case. All of this went on over whatever I was already wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and thick socks, and I sighed forlornly as I stepped out in the ankle-deep snow. I put a hand on my old Jeep, but decided against it. My head was a little sloshy, and I knew it would only take a few minutes with the heat blasting before I was asleep and sliding on the icy road. Instead, I decided to walk to Grandmother's house, and it was only about 2 miles from here, in the bracing cold, which would sober me up before I got there. I set off towards the woods that separated her house from mine. Every time I walked those familiar trails, I always felt like I should be scattering breadcrumbs behind me. My grandmother's house lies sheltered in the woods, and they always feel so dense and foreboding whenever I have to walk through them. The snow and the cold made them quiet, the less hardy birds having left, and many of the other animals asleep for the winter. The tracks, however, told me that there were indeed things out here. My legs started to get tired almost at once. If you've never had to slog through deep snow, then I can tell you that it isn't much fun. As the sun began to set, I began to regret not taking the truck. I could hear the snow making the trees creak and sag, and now and again there was a scurry of movement as some small creature went about its business. Other than the occasional noise, it was as though I had the forest to myself, and my loud footsteps made me feel like the last person on earth. When I heard the snow crunch nearby, I swung to see what was there. The sound had startled me. My own feet were the only thing making much noise out here, but I found nothing. By the sound of the crunch, I would have thought it was a reindeer, or maybe a large bird trying to forage below the snow. In the dim light, I couldn't even see where the prints were, and I started slogging a little faster, worried it might be a wild dog or something. The crunching came again, but I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. When it crunched again, closer this time, I started moving even faster. Going too fast would be a great way to break an ankle or fall and impale myself on a tree limb, but the crunching and lack of a source was starting to freak me out. The snowing sky was already overcast, and the sun was setting behind me. The thought of being out here after dark made my skin crawl. The idea of getting lost in a stretch of wood that would become unnavigatable once the sun went down made me quicken my pace again. My footsteps were loud, cutting through the silence like a foghorn, but somehow I could still hear the steps behind me as I nearly jogged through the ankle-deep snow. What I had thought might be a reindeer or a wild dog now sounded like something much larger. It was very rare, but polar bears sometimes got stuck on ice floes and found their way over here. I had seen something online about it, I thought, and I could just see a big hungry polar bear loping behind me as it prepared to make a quick meal out of me. I didn't dare look back as I heard the crunch come down not 8 feet behind me. It hit the ground hard enough to dislodge snow from the trees, and I started booking it as best I could. What the hell was it? Iceland didn't have a lot of large predators, none that came this close to settled areas, and my mind began to travel back to a time when I was young and sitting warm around Grandma's fire. My cousins and I had always loved the stories about trolls and elves, stories of great heroes who slew the former and were aided by the latter, and we always took up sticks when we played and pretended to swing mighty swords at the knees of ugly, hulking trolls. The idea of being devoured by a large, slobbering troll, my mind showing me the one from Harry Potter, seemed less fun now that I was being chased by one through a fairy tale forest. I glanced behind me in a blind panic, not wanting to see, but wanting to know nonetheless, and I felt my boot sink into a hole. I went down, face first in the snow, and nearly head first onto a tree. I rolled over to face whatever was now surely going to get me, preparing to fight. My ancestors had been men who settled this land, men who rode onto the shores in boats with axes and tamed the wilderness, and I would be damned if I would die with my head in the snow like a blubbering baby. What I saw looming over me was no troll. What I saw looming over me was much, much worse. When I had drawn him, I had made his legs look like waving noodles. I had drawn him with a tabby cat coat and a pair of big, friendly yellow eyes. He had been given the Cheshire Cat's grin and a pair of pointy ears that made him look like Batman. He had looked friendly, goofy, something a child couldn't possibly be afraid of. The Yule Cat was none of those things. His coat was black as twice-baked charcoal, and his bones and muscles seemed to shift beneath it, like they might be something living under his skin. Its legs were long and powerful, like a panther or a jaguar, and its paws left tracks as big as hubcaps, with claws like stilettos. His mouth was filled with 2 big teeth, and the tips seemed to poke at his lips painfully as its slaver ran pink from his jaws. Its ears had been mostly chewed off, sitting on its head like rounded nubs that barely seemed big enough to be ears at all. Its eyes, though, its eyes were the worst. Its yellow eyes blazed like torches, their centers crackling red, and when it loosed a long, loud yowl, I felt my snow pants fill with piss. I was saved by sheer dumb luck. Its yowl had loosed some of the snow from the tree over its head, and when it fell, it coated the Yule Cat's face in a cold blanket of surprise. I rolled away, and when I did, the beast lunged at me. It ran smack into the tree I had nearly fallen into and yowled again. More snow fell on it then, and the cat hissed angrily as its claws shredded the tree to pieces. I didn't wait around to be the next scratching post for this thing. I ran through the snow like a reindeer, churning it up as my fear gave me new purpose. I could see the smoke from Grandma's chimney, but I knew I had to be another quarter of a mile from the house. The shadows were gathering, and I knew that I was dead as soon as this thing got its bearings. When it came after me, I realized it had only been playing with me before. Its crunching step sounded dinosauric, and it cleared the distance between us easily. It swiped at me as I ran, and the claws slid easily through my thick jacket. The back suddenly felt cold as the goose down spilled out of it, and I began to realize that I was running on borrowed time. I had to find some way to lose it. I had to find some way to use its size against it. I needed a place to hide and catch my breath, my lungs burning and my head swimming with exertion. That's when I passed the Himmeltree and realized where I was. When we were children, there was a tall tree that we used as a landmark. We called it the Himmeltree, the sky tree, because it always seemed like it soared up into the clouds. My older cousins and I had hiked to the tree once, nearly a quarter of a mile into the woods, and found that the tree lived up to its name. It was massive, 60 feet of wood like iron, and beneath it was a series of roots that looked like a cage. The soil had pushed away from them, and as kids we would crawl beneath the tree and camp in relative comfort. The spot was large for children, but would be snug for me. I was hoping that it would be too snug for this hellcat as well. I booked it, running flat out as the tree soared up to greet me. I jumped over a sprawl of fallen trees, something I remembered from childhood, and prayed that maybe the cat wouldn't be so lucky. When I heard him hiss and stumble a moment later, I knew that his luck had run out. I didn't look to see how badly he had spilled. I fell on my belly and prayed that I had the angle right as I slid between the roots of the huge tree. I thumped my shoulder, the tough old root hurting as I hit them, but I made it mostly under the tree as the cat scrambled after me. I winced as his claws caught my leg, ripping through my snow pants and jeans to sink into meat, but I shook him off before he could pull me out and was soon snug beneath the wooden canopy of the huge old tree. The underside was just as I remembered it. It was damp from snow run, but the frozen snow had mostly covered it, so I was left in a crystalline world of domed white. The cat screamed in agony, shooting a paw between the roots and searching for me in frustration. I huddled against the side of the tree, not wanting to be found by those furtive claws, and stayed as still and quiet as I could. The scrambling went on for some time, but the cat finally removed its sooty paw. I heard it crunching off into the forest then, lumbering away like a large black shadow as it disappeared into the woods. I stayed still, fearing some trick, but it went right on moving until its heavy footsteps were only slight crunches in the distance. I stayed put, though, blowing on my hands as my wet pants and bleeding leg began to make me shiver. I would freeze to death out here if I stayed too long, but I was afraid that the Yule Cat might double back and wait for me to leave. I shivered for as long as I could, feeling the temperature drop as the sun crept closer to down. Finally, I decided I'd rather be eaten than freeze to death. I crawled out, and when I wasn't immediately set upon, I started stumbling towards my grandmother's house. She was waiting in the doorway for me, a mug of spiced cider in her hand, and a concerned grimace spread across her face. "He found you out there, didn't he?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I've been sitting by the fire and letting her feed me and nurse me back to health for a few hours. She bandaged my leg and took my shredded clothes away. She set a plate of food in front of me, and when I finished the spiced cider, she brought me tea and told me to rest. Before she went back to her room to sleep, she dropped a package on my lap. It was a new sheepskin coat, lovely to see and soft to touch. I couldn't imagine what it had cost her, though I knew what it had almost cost me. "He won't bother you now," she said, and made her way to bed, as I sat convulsing by the fire. So, heed your elders when they tell you the old stories. I was lucky, but you can't always count on luck. The Yule Cat still lurks in the hills and woods, searching for those he deems ungrateful and underdressed. Don't take the clothes you get for Christmas so lightly, because they could save your life if you find yourself in the sights of the Yule Cat. That wind sure is getting capricious out there. I really hope it doesn't blow the lights off the house. They were a bugger to get up, especially given that we don't get snow here in Florida. We get rain or sleet, so not one of the best days. I'm still trying to get warm from all that rain. Tying in with our last story, it's not uncommon to get clothes for Christmas. It's not a sought-after gift for children, but I can certainly tell you, in my old age, there's nothing I love more than a pack of socks, or maybe some new jeans, or maybe even a good old pair of boots. But I do hope that whoever buys you clothes this Christmas doesn't shop at the same thrift store that our next story comes from. After all, we wouldn't want you to run afoul of the sweater. I didn't want the sweater in the first place. From the first time I laid eyes on the damn thing, I knew it would haunt me until the day I died. I first saw it in a thrift store window when I was 10 years old. It was a lumpy green thing made out of thick yarn, an ugly monstrosity that looked like someone's grandmother had knitted badly. As much as I hated it, I was also drawn to it. Even as I stared, I thought I could see a pair of big, goggly eyes in the pattern. Two sharp teeth floating amongst the swirls of thread seemed eager to bite me as I slid it on. The arms ended in little tassels that looked like claws, sharp claws that looked like needles. I hated it, but I was drawn to it in that way that children are drawn to anything that might end their perceived immortality. Mom must have noticed my interest. 2 weeks later, just as the autumn chill began to rise, she gave it to me one morning so I could wear it to school. She pulled it out from behind her back, flourishing it like the end of some magic trick. She smiled hugely, clearly thinking she had something I really wanted. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I was again filled with a sense of dread that she must have picked up on. "It's the sweater you liked so much," she said, looking a little hurt. "You really seemed taken with it when you saw it back at the store." Mom didn't have the money to buy me much. Dad had left when I was a baby, and she worked as a waitress to put food on the table and a roof over my head. We didn't have a lot of money for presents, and I could tell that however much this sweater had cost was too much for me to act anything but grateful. I pulled it on, not really wanting it on my skin, but pretending it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was made out of scratchy wool that I just knew at first glance would make me feel too warm. It rubbed at my skin like steel wool as it settled on my arms. It just felt wrong as it sat against my smooth skin, and I immediately wanted to take it off. It felt like there were bugs in it. As I walked to the door, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe roaches or earwigs had gotten into the fabric. She walked me to the bus stop, all the while smiling at me as I pretended the sweater wasn't the worst thing I'd ever worn. As the bus pulled away from the curve, I yanked it off and stuffed it in my backpack. My friend Mark looked at me strangely. "New sweater?" "Mom found it for me, but it's just about the most uncomfortable sweater ever." "I thought it looked kind of cool," Mark said, "like Slimer from the Ghostbusters." The movies were pretty popular around this time, and I had to admit that it did look pretty ghoulish. The pattern on the front, big teeth and bug eyes, did make it look a little like the green ghost from the movie, and we talked about it all the way to school. I forgot all about the sweater until I got home that afternoon. I found it crumpled at the bottom of my backpack when I got started on my homework. I took it out and laid it over my desk chair. As I sat to do my homework, though, it began to itch at me. I took it and tossed it in a chair by the closet door instead, getting back to work. Even having it against my skin made me feel weird, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at it as I did my homework. It felt like it was looking at me somehow, staring at me with those huge bug eyes, and I felt haunted by it as it sat placidly. When Mom came home a few hours later, she seemed happy to see the sweater. "I knew you would like it. Was it warm enough today?" "Yeah, it was just right," I lied. I finished my homework and went downstairs to help with dinner. Typically, I would have sat in my room or watched television till dinner was made, but tonight, I just wanted an excuse to be out of my room, away from the sweater. My room felt invaded every time I looked at it, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there for a few hours. I didn't think about it again until it was time for bed. I came into my room, pajama bottoms and white undershirt on, with my mouth still feeling minty from the toothpaste. I was ready to climb into bed when I saw the sweater again. For some reason, I just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I picked it up, the coarse fabric scritching at my hands, and tossed it under the bed. I knew it meant nothing, a meaningless gesture, but I didn't want it watching me while I slept. Mom came in and kissed my forehead. "Good night, honey," she said as she turned off the lights and closed the door. I burrowed down under the covers and started getting comfortably sleepy. It had been a long day, with another one to follow, and as I began to edge towards sleep, I started to hear a weird noise from somewhere in the room. It sounded like someone dragging wire across the hardwood, and as I focused my attention on it, I could hear the sound sliding across the boards. I sat in my bed and looked for it, that harsh slithering that wound its way over the flooring. As I cast my eyes over by the chair, I saw the source of the noise. It was the sweater. It was sitting on the chair where I had thrown it earlier, leering at me with its toothy grin. It couldn't be there. I had thrown it under the bed. But there it sat, as though I'd never grabbed it in the first place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't thrown it. Maybe I just imagined the whole thing, and now I was just scaring myself. I rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. As I tossed and turned, though, I could almost feel those bug eyes looking at me. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it all out. As I lay there, I imagined I could hear that wire dragging across the wood again. It was like the scratching of claws times 10, and I could hear it going under my bed and towards the wall. I peeked out from under the covers and looked towards the chair, making sure that hideous sweater was still there and not responsible for the noises. The chair was empty, though. I sat straight up and peered around the semi-dark, searching for the sweater. It couldn't have moved. It was a sweater, a stupid sweater, and even my 10-year-old brain knew the sweater didn't just get up and move around on its own. I looked over the edge of the bed, seeing nothing, and hesitantly hung upside down so I could glance under the bed. In my 10-year-old brain, that was where the monsters lived, and this sweater had become a monster now. I peeked, afraid to see it, but it wasn't there. Only a few toys and some dirty clothes greeted me. I looked back at the chair, still finding it empty, and snuggled down under the covers so I could get some sleep. I awoke in the morning to a terrible pain in my arm. The sweater was in bed with me, curled around my arm as though it had gotten tangled on me in the night, and I wrenched it off violently. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to contact my skin. As I came free, I saw the source of the pain. On my forearm, on the inside of my arm, was what looked like a bite. As I inspected it in the dewy morning light, I felt sure I could pick out individual teeth marks on the flesh of my arm. I looked frantically at the crumpled green garment in the corner and suddenly felt sure that it was the source of the bite. I ran downstairs to show my mom, who was just starting to get breakfast things together. She looked at the bite and declared it a rash. "Probably from your new sweater," she said, and I could hear real sadness in her voice. She still believed that I really liked that ghastly thing, and the thought that it had caused me pain made her sad. She said she would wash it today after school and have it back to me by tomorrow, and I remember hoping that it shrank in the wash. I thought all day about the terrible garment coming back too small or shredded by some fluke, and the idea brought me some little amount of joy throughout the day. When I got home, however, I heard the washing machine in full swing and found a note on the table saying that Mom had gone to get groceries. I figured she put the sweater in with the load and went upstairs to start my homework. Mark and Davy wanted to ride bikes later, and I knew that if I got my math done before dinner, I'd be able to go riding with them before the sun went down. When I opened the door, I was startled by the green sweater sitting on the chair where I had left it last night. I was angry at myself for a moment. Why was I so afraid of this stupid sweater? I grabbed it up, yarn digging into my hands like steel wool, and took it to the laundry room. I opened the washer and threw it inside, slamming the lid closed and stomping back upstairs to start my homework. I finished quickly, and when Mom got home, I went outside to play. I spent the afternoon riding bikes and jumping dirt ramps with my friends, and as the streetlights came on, I turned for home. When it came time for bed, I walked back up to my room to find the sweater back on the chair where it had been earlier. There was a stack of freshly folded clothes on my dresser, but for some reason, Mom had put the sweater back on the chair. I walked around the sweater as I got ready for bed, but I kept thinking I could see it move out of the corner of my eye. It didn't leave the chair, but I thought I saw the arms wiggle or the waistband shiver slightly as I walked around the room. I went straight to bed after lights out, and in the morning, I found more bites on my arm. 3 new bites, to be exact, each one on the underside of my arm, not on the outer arm where everyone might notice them easily, and each one looking much the same as the first. The sweater wasn't in bed with me this time, but I knew it had been the one to do it. Mom still thought it was a rash, but I was convinced that they were bites. For the next few weeks, I tried various measures to keep the sweater away from me. I left it in other rooms, sometimes with the door locked, but it always found its way back to my room. The closet was no obstacle at all for it, and twice I awoke to see it sitting in the chair as the door slowly closed behind it. One night, I stuffed it in the washing machine and closed the door locking behind it, and I still woke up the next morning to find it in my bed. My sleep started to suffer, and I found it hard to get a full night's sleep as I woke up to search for the sweater. My teacher told my mother that my performance was suffering, and I was given DRs several times for sleeping in class. If they'd seen what was under my sleeves, they would have probably had some questions for my mother, too. The bites were numerous, red and oozing blood sometimes. I kept them closely guarded, because if my teacher found out, I felt like my mother could be in big trouble. I kept them from both my teacher and my mother, not wanting her to ask questions either. And as it went on, our relationship became strained. She knew I wasn't sleeping well, but she wouldn't even entertain the idea that it was due to some evil sweater. She thought I was looking for attention, that I was just a typical child with an overactive imagination. But she couldn't take off work just to sit at home with me and protect me from a piece of clothing. At one point, she even threw the sweater in the garbage, thinking that would solve everything. But when it reappeared in my bedroom, she accused me of keeping it around to get attention. After 2 weeks of being terrorized, I decided to finally put a stop to it. That night, I stayed awake and watched it. The next day was Saturday, and I knew Mom wouldn't care if I slept in. I was going to catch it in the act and show Mom that it was hurting me. Maybe then she would let me get rid of it. I had a big metal flashlight with a thick blanket I was going to catch it in. I would hold on to it until it ran out of steam, and then show my mom so she wouldn't think I was dreaming. I watched the red numbers on my Ninja Turtles alarm clock tick slowly by, and by 11:30, I was having trouble staying awake. The sweater hadn't done anything but sit there all night, and as my eyes got heavier and heavier, I found myself slipping towards sleep. I lost the fight before midnight, and woke up with my head against the blanket. I looked at the clock and saw that the numbers read 2:45 a.m. I swept the light around the chair and tried to orient myself. The beam fell on an empty chair, and I couldn't help but feel dread mounting. Where had it gone? Had it slipped off the chair while I was asleep? As I searched for it in the beam of light, though, I heard a familiar sound of wire scraping against the wood behind me. I turned the beam onto my headboard, and there was the sweater. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming, but as the flashlight illuminated it, I had to come to grips with the idea that what I was seeing was very real. The bug-eyed pattern had become a real set of bulbous eyes. The green body was a voluminous mass of fibers and filaments, and the teeth had become large and snapping. It was perched on my headboard, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion of light. It emitted a loud, otherworldly scream as it leapt at my face, and I swung the flashlight without thinking. It smacked into it with a soft woof sound, and I watched it fall to the floor next to the closet. The beam fell on it again, and it scrambled across the floor as it frantically crawled for the bed. I sat on the bed and listened as it rustled beneath the box spring. I had glimpsed its true form now. I had seen the wicked teeth that had left marks on my arm, and I was not about to let it sink them into me again. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights, and scooped up the sweater as I headed down the hall. The hall closet was stuffed with old tubs for storage. As I wrenched open the door, I found what I was looking for on the second shelf. Mom had an old popcorn tin, the kind you give people for Christmas when you're not sure what else to give them. As I reached for it, I felt the sweater shriek and scramble towards me. It knew what I meant to do, and it knew that it would be stuck if I did. I grabbed it before it could latch onto me and stuffed it down into the metal guts of the tin. I was going to trap it in here for good, a good long time, and there wasn't a thing that it could do about it. In the light, it was just an ordinary sweater. I made use of this knowledge and stuffed it into the tin. I heard it thrashing around in the tin and held the lid closed as I looked around for duct tape or something else to keep the lid closed. A few layers of tape over the lid, and I felt confident that it wouldn't be able to escape. I stacked a few boxes on top of it for good measure, and left it thrashing at the bottom of the closet. As I went to sleep, I could still hear it beating feebly at its prison walls. The noise was like a lullaby for my tired soul. I'd like to say that this is the end of the ordeal, but this story is actually my reason for writing it all. It's been 25 years since that night, and I had all but forgotten about it. I had put it off as the overactive imagination of a child, just like my mother had, until I came home from work today. After college, I moved several states away, taking a job as an architect for a big firm in Chicago. That's where I met Emily, and now we have a child of our own, my daughter Carrie. My mother loves her granddaughter, and comes to see her whenever she can, but most of the time, my mother's presence is felt through her packages. Cookies, toys, anything to make my daughter smile. And when I got home today, I found one of those packages open on the kitchen table. The box was empty, but there was a note inside addressed to Carrie. Hi, Carrie. Grandma was cleaning out the attic and found something she thought you might like. It was your dad's when he was your age, and he used to make up all sorts of strange stories about it. It looked so lonely when I found it. I thought you might have more use for it than me in the Windy City. Love you, Grandma. As I looked at the note, my blood ran cold. What had my mother found tucked away in the attic? I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room. catching sight of my daughter as she lay on the living room floor. She was coloring something in her binder, using her crayons to fill in whatever picture she had just drawn. At that moment, though, my focus was on the familiar green sweater she was wearing. The yarn was a little faded, but the bug eyes still stared at me, and the teeth smiled with that delirious mirth. As I stared, it seemed to say, "Hello, old friend. Thought you'd gotten rid of me, huh? But here I am. Time for our game to start again." Carrie turned around and smiled at me, springing up and wrapping her arms around me in a big hug. I had to stop myself from shuddering as the sweater touched me, and she stepped back a little so I could see when she was done. She did a little twirl so I could take in the whole thing, and it didn't seem to repulse her the way it had always repulsed me. "Isn't it great, Daddy? Grandma sent me this cool new sweater. I love it. It's so soft, and it's so warm." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded dumbly and walked back into the kitchen to fix myself a drink. After the second drink, I began to calm down a little, and I started writing this after my hands stopped shaking. I don't have a clue what to do. How do you tell your daughter that she's wearing something that tormented you for 2 weeks? How do you convey to her that something she loves is evil? What do I do when the bites start appearing? How do I rid myself once and for all of this evil sweater? The underside of this tree is looking awfully bare. I guess next week it'll be time to start wrapping all of that stuff I've got hidden in the closet for later. But, I don't know, maybe some stories would make the wrapping go along a little better, don't you think? We've all had coworkers that were like family, I would hope. I certainly have. If there's one thing about corrections, it's you spend 12 hours a day around these people, and you see them more than your family, so they begin to become more like family than your actual family. This story, however, is about another family I had once. A fast food family, let us say. That's right. This one is another semi-real story that I may have embellished just a little bit. But it talks about a time when we sat around during the holidays and just told stories about better times, different times, times that were maybe a little spooky. So, have a seat. I hope you've still got some cocoa left. And let's hear about the sewer. When I was in high school, I had a job at a local fast food chain. I worked there for 4 years, freshman year right up until I left for college, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have some good times there. Holidays are spent together because we don't have much of a choice. Managers who were either good people or just entertaining to work with, coworkers who really became more like friends the longer you were there, and everything in between. I'm not going to say the whole 4 years was great, but it was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything. Hell, I think everyone should have to work fast food for at least a few months. Gives you a little bit of perception on the guy behind the counter. The chain I worked for was unique in many ways. They were one of the few who let people host events in the lobby. We had a small concert there once for a local metal band, which made for some entertaining times. We had a policy to hire 14-year-olds under special circumstances, which got us into trouble more than once, due to 14-year-old girls flirting with much older guys. This led to allegations of underage hookups in the back room. They had a weird rehabilitated cons program that hired ex-cons fresh from prison, too. That one worked really well with the aforementioned hiring 14-year-olds policy, and also led to a couple of guys robbing the store after getting off shift. I don't even think they bothered to take their name tags off, so they were pretty easy to catch. One of my favorites, though, was our 24-hour program, which ran pretty much every summer that I worked there. You see, since I was under 18, I wasn't allowed to work past 10 on a school night. But during the summer, I could work as late or as early as I wanted, and I took full advantage of this to fill my pockets with cash. As you may have guessed, this program added a third shift to the usual 2-shift schedule, and it was a 12-hour shift to boot. You'd come in at 6 p.m., just as the dinner rush was ramping up, and work until 6 a.m., when the openers were coming in for their second cup of coffee. The hours were shit, and the pay still wasn't great. no pay differential for late shifts. But what made it worthwhile was the 4-hour lull in between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. You might have to churn out some cheeseburgers or chicken nuggets for a bunch of drunk college kids, or a carload of stoners who might wander in wanting nuggets. But for the most part, you just kept the store clean and kind of hung out. It was usually a light crew, too, and on the night the story takes place, I had a good bunch of guys with me. I'd gotten my friend a job there that year. We'll call him Ryan, because he might read this. He and Trevor were on the grill that night. I was running the drive-thru window, and my favorite manager was watching the store, a guy named Joseph. Joseph was one of those rare managers that didn't have his head crammed up his ass, and gave just enough of a shit to fly under the radar. He was a cool guy. I sometimes wonder whatever happened to him. Anyway, it had been a long night, to say the least. The dinner rush was particularly bad, so as it starts to die down, we picked over the old food in the warming box and went to the break room to hang out. Some managers frowned on this, some would even write you up for it, but Joseph was cool and genuinely liked most of us. The lobby doors were locked at midnight to keep the weirdos out, and with the headset turned up so I could hear if a car rolled into the drive-thru, we started eating old cheeseburgers and swapping stories. The stories started pretty blandly. This thing that happened or that thing that someone had heard about, but finally we fell into creepy stories about stuff we had experienced. I told them about the weirdo in our parking lot a few years ago who'd creeped a bunch of people out before the cops arrived. They found his wife's head in the passenger seat, along with a giant bloody machete. We thought he meant to rob or murder us, but it turns out he was just having a nervous breakdown in our parking lot after offing his old lady. Trevor tried to top it with a story about the time he'd been drinking with his cousin out in a cornfield, but none of us believed him. He said the old farmer had come out in the cornfield, slasher flick style, and screamed at them to get off his property while chasing them with a pitchfork. We piled in the truck and sped off, but something hit the back tailgate hard. Well, we didn't stop till we got to my cousin's house, and what we saw when we got out was the last thing we expected. He paused for dramatic effect. "What was it?" said Ryan, after Trevor had milked it for a little too long. "A pitchfork. The guy had thrown a pitchfork and stuck it right in the tailgate of the truck. If it had been a little higher, it would have come through the back rear glass and took all three of us right in the back of the head." He paused again like this should have been a dramatic revelation, but Ryan and I both shared a look like we doubted most of this had actually happened. When Joseph spoke up from the doorway, all three of us jumped. He'd been counting down the safe, so he hadn't been there for the start of the spooky stories. But it appeared he had come in just in time to catch the tail end of Trevor's story. Joseph was older than all three of us, a guy in his 30s with a wife and kids, and we often forgot that when we were hanging out because of how naturally he related to us. He was an avid gamer who did all the cool stuff we all hoped we'd be doing when we were adults. Right then, though, he had a decidedly dad look on his face as he addressed our little gathering of storytellers. "I've got a story for you guys," he said, spinning a chair around and sitting in it with his arms folded over the back. "And it's a true story, too. You want to hear it?" We did, and he began. I was working at the downtown store at the time, living in this dingy little apartment with my wife. We were broke, and she was pregnant and out on maternity leave. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree during the day, so nights were all I could count on to pay the bills. This was before the owner started up the third shift, or I'd have been all over that. So there I was, working the 3 to 11 shift, busting my hump, and we had a real hard-ass manager who kept us late almost every night, usually unpaid overtime, since we couldn't clean it right the first time, apparently. So most nights, I was lucky to get out of there about 12:30. The night in question had been especially bad, and I didn't get permission to leave until almost 1 in the morning. It was Friday night, though, so I knew I could sleep up until shift tomorrow if I needed to. Picking up my bag, I started trudging home through the chilly January air. Now, I know it rarely gets cold here, being Florida and all, but that winter had been particularly bad. They had all talked about snow more than once, and it had obliged us by dumping a semi-solid sheet of slush all over the place the night before. Most of it was off the road, but the wind was howling at me as I pulled my coat tight and walked up the deserted center of the road. Now, downtown is usually party central, unless you feel like driving to the beach. But tonight, it was so cold that even the bars and coffee shops and all-night diners had shuttered their faces and gone to bed. The streetlights were on, and the sewer grates were belching steam up into the cold night. The whole scene looked pretty creepy to me. So, I'm walking up the center of the road, and there's a damn good reason I'm doing that too, in case you were wondering. I was made aware of Stephen King's It from a very young age, and it had given me a real phobia about sewer drains. I didn't want to walk too close because, even with all that hard-won 23 years of wisdom I had, I just knew that on a cold, lonely night like tonight, I would get a taloned hand around my ankle and a quick trip into the sewer if I stepped too close to those smoking holes. So I walked right up the center of the street, as far from the grates as I could, and that particular night, it led me into trouble. So I'm walking up the center line, boots clomping on the asphalt, as I made my way through this way too quiet street. That's when I heard a noise. I thought at first it was the sound of steam escaping the grates. It was a hissing noise, after all, but when it came again, I heard it for what it was. You remember in grade school when some kid behind you wants to pass a note, so he makes that psst sound at you to get your attention? Well, that's what this sound was, a psst sound from the left side of the road. So I turn around, but I don't see anyone. I start walking again, and that same psst sound comes again from the left side of the road. I squinted at the dark alley between two buildings, getting ready to start flying if someone comes running out to mug me. But it's empty. That's when I heard it again. This time, somebody says something in a low voice, too. It sounds like, psst, hey buddy, followed by that sound again, psst, psst. Then I look down, and, I kid you not, there is a face in the drainage grate. As the steam comes curling up around it, I see a midnight black face looking out at me, and the only thing I can make out is its eyes, and they look fucking huge. I booked it. I start running, but as I run, I hear the voice behind me, shouting for me to come back. Then I realize the voice isn't behind me anymore. I glance to my left, and I see that it's following me from the openings of the sewer grates. Loud feet are slapping on the stone down there, and he's trying to get my attention. That's when I hear him yell real loud and fall with a watery splash. I didn't slow down in the least bit, but I saw the black ice a little too late when I turned back around. I hit it. My feet shot straight up and out from under me. I fell back hard against the pavement, and I was pretty sure I had broken my elbow when I came down hard on the concrete. At the time, I was trying to make my head stop spinning as the black spots danced around. I struggled up to my elbow, wincing as I got up on my hurt one, just as the spots started to go away. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. "What?" I asked, unable to help myself, wrapped up so deeply until at that moment I had barely realized I was breathing. The manhole cover, not 5 feet away, was coming up, and the face is looking out at me. I tried to get up, and I slipped again as this dripping, oozing thing climbed out of the opening. He towers over me from my prone position, and I start pushing with my legs as I slide away from him. He comes out oozing and quivering from the dark tunnel, and in my mind, he is the apotheosis of every shadowy creature from every horror movie I have ever seen. He is the creature from the Black Lagoon. He is it, the blob, and he's coming to drag me back down into the darkness so he can slowly devour me. His foot slaps down hard on the concrete as he menaces towards me. I'm still trying to slide away on my butt, my elbow starting to cry out now, and when my low back hits the curve, I just froze there as this creature from the midnight cinema towers over me, its oozing flesh dripping onto the concrete. It takes large, ponderous steps as it moves in on me, and at this point, I'm so gripped with fear I can't even move. Its flesh falls to the ground in gooey plops, and after 1,000,000 years crammed into 5 seconds, it's standing not 3 feet away from me. It bends its mountainous head down towards me, and in a gravelly voice, it says the last 3 words I figured I would ever hear. And they're the last 3 words I ever expected to hear from a creature like this." At this point, he looks at us, his mask of pent-up terror melting into a creepy smile, the creepiest smile I've ever seen, as he gravels out, "Got a light?" We sat, dumbfounded, for nearly 15 seconds before Trevor sputters, "What?" Joseph laughs. He asked if I had a light. It turns out he was a homeless guy who'd been living in the sewers to stay warm. He had gotten himself a pry bar so he could hook it under the lid, and he'd been staying in the sewers at night where it was warm. He had no clue why it was so steamy down there, but it was a great place to sleep when the alternative was freezing your ass off in the park or down by the pier with the other vags. When I asked him why he was covered in what I hoped was mud, he said that he'd been chasing after me, trying to get a lighter to spark a cigarette. Then he'd fallen in a muddy slush puddle and gotten covered in the stuff. I laughed and handed him the lighter out of my bag, an old Zippo my old man had given me, and considered it a fair trade for a great story. I've told that story so many times over the years, and it never gets old. We laughed about that story and Joseph's deadpan way of building it up right until the very end, for years to come. I've begged him to retell it 150 times. And it never gets old. So if you're ever downtown on a cold night and someone tries to get your attention from the closest sewer grate, just remember that it's probably some vagrant trying to stay warm and have a smoke. And if they drag you down into the sewer for a slow process of digestion, then I guess I was wrong, wasn't I? One more story left, and then I think we might be done for today at least. I'm sure you've got your own holiday activities to do and don't have time to sit around and listen to me ramble all day. But maybe you do, and maybe even if you don't, I appreciate it a lot that you spend your mornings or afternoons or whatever time you spend here with me, hearing stories. In this season of giving, sometimes we forget about the less fortunate, the downtrodden, those that may be living rough or going through it, the homeless people that exist on the fringes of our world. And sometimes we forget that those beings may have their own reasons for doing this. So, for our last story, let's take a look, shall we, at the Beggars Deal. "Penny for your thoughts, young man?" I glanced down at the old man as he sat in the snow, his jeans getting crusty from the ice. He held a grubby coin in his threadbare glove, and his eyes looked up imploring me to take it. Homeless people weren't exactly rare in the city, and I was honestly tired of being asked for change today. I had been asked for change as I went to work that morning, several times. I'd been asked when I stepped out to have a smoke around 10 that morning. I'd been asked again as I went to lunch, and twice more as I returned. I'd been asked for handouts throughout the day, but this was the first one who had offered to give me anything in return. I reached down hesitantly, and when he moved it out of the way, I figured he would make his pitch now. The coin was rare, the coin would be special, he would want something for it, and I would be asked to give. "Your thoughts first, son. An even trade, I'm sure." I drew in a noseful of cold air, thinking about making something up, before finally settling on the truth. "Okay, you know what I'm thinking about? I'll tell you. I pass people like you every day, people on the street with nothing better to do than beg. Why not try to better yourself with all this time you have? Why not drag yourself out of your situation, rather than sit and huddle in it? You have the ability to get out of your current quagmire. You choose not to, and that makes me angry." I'd expected the old man to get mad. I expected him to get quiet and take his coin back. But he surprised me when he laughed. "Is that what you think? That we're all just lazy bums out on the road with nothing better to do? I imagine you might change your mind if you had to do it yourself." I scoffed. "Please, living off the generosity of others? This is a city of thousands. Even if only 1% showed you charity, that's still likely more than I make in a week." The old man smiled knowingly, and That should have been my first indication that something was amiss. Even then, I sensed that something didn't feel right here. This wasn't the usual kind of banter one had with a person, even someone like this guy. It was starting to prickle the hair on the back of my neck. Why'd I stop to talk with this fella at all? The whole thing just felt odd. "Want to make a wager on it?" the old beggar asked. He still had the coin out, and when I got a good look at it, I could tell it wasn't what I had thought it was. It was filthy, but it had the underlying gleam of gold. It was unevenly milled and thick on the edge, he showed me. "Live for a week as I do, if you can. After 7 days, if you're still alive, I'll grant you any wish your heart desires." I shook my head, thinking the old man had to be crazy. What was he, some kind of genie? My mind flashed to the Beauty and the Beast story, too, however. Hadn't the fairy come to him on a snowy night and made requests? If I declined his offer, what would the consequences be? I shook my head. I was a grown man out here weighing fairy tales. What was wrong with me? "Sure, old-timer, it's a deal. What do I need to do? Prick my finger? Promise you my firstborn?" "Just take the coin," he said, holding it out. "But make sure you hang on to it. If you go the full week and lose the coin, well, I can't promise it'll end well for you." I rolled my eyes, reaching for it without thinking. I wasn't really afraid that it might be magic, more concerned that it might be coated in fentanyl or acid or something. I had gloves on, though, and I didn't expect that whatever he had coated it in would get through my leather wraps. I lifted the coin to my eye, looking at it in the dim light of the lamp-post, and saw that it was bigger than I had thought it would be. It was the size of a $50, one side picturing a proud king, while the other side a grinning skeleton. The words "Percussum est Della" were printed on the front with "Vivero ve dal mare ab io" emblazoned on the back. I knew that was Latin, but that was all I knew. The coin was old, some ancient edifice of commerce, and as I looked at it in the street lamp, it flashed in my eye with a stabbing pain. The last thing I heard was the old man laughing, and then I fell into darkness for some undetermined amount of time. I was awoken not by my alarm, but by the less than kind tap of a stick on my foot. Hey, I've already told you can't sleep here. Pack it up before I call the cops." I came groggily awake, aware of being cold and slightly damp before anything else. I put a hand up to my eyes, wondering what had been on that coin the old man had given me, and as my vision came into view, I saw a large man in an apron standing over me with a broom. He held it with the blunt end raised, preparing to swing it if I made any sudden moves. I put a hand up and told him that there was some kind of mistake, but when I raised my hand, I saw it was wrapped in threadbare gloves, the same ones that had been holding the coin last night. What's more, my clothes felt scratchy, like bugs had been crawling on me, and as I got up, the man with the broom tensed like he meant to take a swing. "I'm serious. Get the hell out of here before I call the cops." I told him I was going, and as I stumbled out of the alley, I saw that it was early morning. There was still ice on the ground, steam coming up through the sewer vents, and people were milling up the sidewalk on their way to work or wherever. I must have looked a mess because they walked past me without a second glance. The man with the broom was watching me from the mouth of the alley that I'd been sleeping in, and made it pretty clear that if I didn't start moving, he was going to make good on his threat to call the police. As I made my way down the street, I was already reaching for my cell phone. I'd call an Uber and get back to my apartment. I was unsurprised to find it was missing, as was my wallet and my house keys. No problem. They had no idea which apartment I lived in, so the key wouldn't do them any good. A car was something I never saw the need to own, so I had no vehicle for them to steal. The old man had gotten away with about $80 from my wallet at the end of the day, and anything he took from my bank account would be returned. I'd go to my apartment and tell them I'd been mugged, and they would help me get into my place. I hoped the old man had a good laugh after drugging and stripping me, leaving me in an alley as he dressed me like a vag and took my stuff. Live a week like us, indeed. I'd be back in my apartment in a matter of minutes. Then the police could show him what it was like to live as an inmate. I was full of indignant rage as I passed in front of the big shop window not far from my house, and that's when I caught sight of myself in the reflection. At first, I thought the old man was taunting me, following me to see what I would do once I woke up. But when I rounded on him to give him a piece of my mind, I realized I was looking at my own reflection. I was the old man, his leathery skin and short gray hair, and I just stood there, touching my face with my hand as I tried to make sense of it. Live as we live for a week, if you can. I suddenly understood that there would be no going back to my apartment. There would be no talking to my bank or getting my phone replaced. I felt something heavy against my left butt cheek, and I reached into the back of my threadbare jeans to find the coin nestled there. I looked at both sides, the Emperor and the skull, and suddenly discovered that I could read the words there. "Thus the deal is struck," read the Emperor. "Live or be damned by it," said the skull. I wanted to fling it into the street, but I remembered what he had said and slipped it back into my pocket. I had noticed something else that both sides had shared. The minting date was a week from now, and that mirrored what the old man had said too. Live for a week as I live, if you can. I nodded. How hard could it be? That first day was probably my high point. I was full of resolve as I walked around the city. I didn't have any luck with breakfast, but that was okay. I didn't see any need to beg. I'd find money if I needed it. Besides, begging would only prove that he was right. I was going to do something with my week, start a new job, or find an honest way to make money. So, I set out to find work. One look at myself was enough to tell me that I'd be turned away from most upscale jobs. I needed a shave and a haircut badly. My clothes were old and stained, and I needed a bath worse than I needed a meal. All these things were outside my grasp without money, but I knew where I might get some of them. I'd heard of the mission shelters. Everyone had heard of them, seen them on the billboards, or heard their commercials. I knew they had clothes I could use, and maybe facilities I could use to take a shower. If I could get myself back to rights, then I could secure employment and not have to beg. I would likely have to spend a night or two in the mission, but I would have a job and money, and I could get back on my feet before the week was out. I came to the mission around 9 and was met at the door by a man with a clipboard. "Good morning. Are you checking in?" "I was hoping to get some clothes for an interview, maybe a shower and some—" "Terrific," the man said, cutting me off. "Are you part of our employment program? You don't look familiar." "Well, no, but I want to use the clothes to gain employment so I can—" "Unfortunately, sir, those clothes are only for people in our employment program, and there is a sizable waiting list for that program. I can get you on that waiting list, but it's likely to be some time before we can—" Started getting a little indignant. "I mean, the clothes are donated. As a taxpayer, those are my taxes at work. I'll bring them back. I just need to look good for an interview." The man's well-crafted smile was beginning to slip. "Do you have an interview lined up, then?" I realized my mistake and admitted that I didn't. "Well, then, you have no reason to need those clothes. Now, if you'd like to get on our program list, we can do that, but again, that takes time." I was a little put out, the process seeming a little daunting, and I told him I'd like a meal and a shower, if I could. "And I want you to have those things too, but if this is your first time here, then we need you to fill out some paperwork so we can get you on our system. If you'll step right over here, we can—" "Do I need to register for a bowl of soup and a hot shower?" I didn't mean to become belligerent, but I was a little put out by the rigmarole. "Sir, have you been drinking? I believe I detect alcohol on your breath, and you're becoming quite upset. We can't allow you in if you're inebriated, and you have to be 24 hours sober before you can enter the mission. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." I said some things then, things I regret now, and I didn't even see the young bruiser who stepped between us as I got in the clipboard man's face. When he tossed me onto the sidewalk, the man with the clipboard saying I wasn't welcome at the mission again, I got creakily to my feet and checked to see if I was all there. Other than some bruises, I was none the worse for wear. I was still hopeful that I could make my way without them, so I set off to find employment. By the end of the first day, I was shivering on a bench in the park that I'd never seen before. The park was less for joggers and bird watchers, and more for drunks and needlers. A pair of them were sharing syringes near an old oak tree not too far away as I tried to get warm under some newspapers I had scavenged. I tried to ignore my empty belly, too, as I lay with the cold wood beneath me. I hadn't eaten much today, just a part of a sandwich I'd found in a garbage can. I was feeling empty as I tried to sleep. I told myself that tomorrow would be better, and I fell asleep, praying that it would be so. Just 6 more days to go. The next day I woke up ravenous, my head spinning and my mouth dry. It was early, first light, and I knew that if I wanted to eat today, I needed to get some money. As luck would have it, I found something not far from the park. There was a warehouse nearby, and I heard men unloading a truck as they prepared to load up another. I offered to help. Most of the workers looked like scabs anyway, and the guy with the magazine and the cigar told me that he'd beat whatever I broke out of me, and to get to work. I spent a few hours moving boxes from one truck to another, and when the guy came out and told us we were done, he put a $10 bill in my hand and told me thanks. "Come back tomorrow if you want another one," he said. I wanted to be happy as I looked at the crumpled bill, but I realized this wouldn't take me very far if I wasn't careful. I tried to make it last, buying a coffee from a gas station, along with a simple breakfast, but by noon, the tin was spent. I'd been walking the streets, trying to luck into some grunt work. I found another warehouse offering under-the-table jobs, but as the sun went down and we all came to the office to get paid, it seemed that the boss had left, and we were left with no options but to disperse or answer to the police. I went back to the same park again that night, but the cold after the sun went down was too much to bear in the open. I walked around trying to find somewhere to sleep out of the elements, and at around 2, I found a doorway that lacked the little rubber spikes they usually put out to dissuade homeless from sleeping there. As I shivered in the doorway, I told myself it would only be another 5 days. As I slipped into sleep, I hoped I'd be alive to see the end of those 5 days. The next day, day 3, I finally gave in and began begging. The job I'd found the day before wasn't open, the gates barred, and the snow deep enough to keep the trucks off the road. I was hungry, I was cold, and I didn't dare go back to the mission. So I found the warmest spot I could find and began panhandling. The crowd that morning was small, the snow closing a lot of the businesses, and they weren't overly generous. By the time noon rolled around, I had a few dollars and some change in the can that I'd managed to scoop out of a dumpster. It got me some junk that wasn't very filling, and I walked around looking for work as the snow began to melt. I was a little more wary about taking odd jobs, lest I get taken like the day before. And as the night began to settle and the people made their way home, I once again set up to beg. I was dozing against a wall, feeling weak and tired from the cold, when someone cleared their throat loudly. I opened my eyes to find 2 cops standing over me, looking cold and grumpy. "Move along, sir. You know you can't do that here." He poked my can with his foot, sending it tipping over as the small amount of change rattled out. "I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just hungry." "Doesn't matter. Hungry or not, you can't do that here. Get moving before we move you." I wanted to get indignant, but I simply didn't have the energy. I scooped up the coins and started trudging through the snow again. I didn't know where I was going, but I remembered the old man's words and knew I would lose what precious coins I had if I got arrested. I wasn't even halfway through the week, and I already felt like I might not make it to reap my reward. The next few days were a blur. I remember trying to donate plasma and being turned away for various reasons. I looked for work, but the snow had ground a lot of businesses to a halt. I found warm places that would feed me, churches and soup kitchens, but they weren't equipped to let people stay. I ended up sleeping rough both nights, shivering on stoops or under the slight cover of alleys, my blanket getting soaked in the snow as it melted beneath me. It was the most miserable I'd ever been, and it made me wonder where I'd ever gotten the idea that the homeless of the city were lazy. Looking back on my words to the vagrant, words spoken out of ignorance, I felt a deep sense of shame as I remembered how I had talked to him. He was just trying to get a meal, just trying to survive or find somewhere that wasn't a chilly bench to sleep for the night. And all I had seen was a leech trying to get fat off the hard work of others. As I lay beside a dumpster Friday night, watching people drink in the warm light of a familiar bar, I knew I'd never make that mistake again. Saturday dawned cold and dark, the snow melt making the ice thick on the sidewalks as the world came awake again. I had some luck after helping the owner of the store I was sleeping beside clear the ice from the front of the stoop. He patted my shoulder, giving me a plastic bag of sandwiches he was about to throw away. I marveled at them, counting about 12 of the plastic-wrapped squares, and he even threw in a cup of coffee to go along with it. I tried to tell him it was too much, but he waved his hands and laughed. "You're doing me a favor, really. Those sandwiches were going to go in the garbage before I almost busted my ass on that slick sidewalk. If you can get some use out of them, more power to you. Take them with my thanks." By 10, I had eaten about 5 of them, the coffee long gone, and I felt full for the first time in quite a while. It was something I had taken for granted, that feeling of being nearly too full. But as I sat in the park, my blanket keeping the worst of the snow from soaking into me, it felt good to be here again. I had refilled the coffee cup from a nearby fountain, and as I drank water and soaked up the sunshine, I felt pretty good about the direction I was going. "Hey, friend!" came a familiar voice, and my eyes snapped open as I started to bolt. It was a man in similar dress, his face scraggly from many days of beard growth, and he was smiling through his remaining teeth at me. I could smell him between the 10 feet that separated us, but it wasn't an altogether unpleasant smell. He simply smelled earthy as opposed to bad, stale in a way that made me think he was taking care of his clothes when he could, and the jacket he wore bulged humorously, making me think he wore at least 2. "Whoa there, didn't mean to scare you. I was just wondering if I could trade you for one of them sandwiches. I've got some of them vitamin C packs from the free clinic. You can mix them with your water and get something nice to drink to go along with your full belly." He was holding out a crumpled silver packet with the words "Emergency" on the front, and I nodded as I held out a ham and cheese for him. He smiled again, asking if he could sit as he tore into the sandwich with gusto. He had clearly not been eating well, and I realized that must have been the way I had torn into the first one that I'd eaten earlier. "Name's Carter. Good to meet you, friend. Haven't seen you around. Are you new in town?" I told him I was, since it wasn't technically a lie. He laughed and told me I'd picked a heck of a time to come to town. It was the worst snowstorm they had seen in a long time, and the homeless guys were having a hell of a time keeping warm. Between the mission and their paperwork, and the cops and their endless rage for guys just trying to get by, and the shopkeepers not wanting us in their alleys or stoops, it's getting hard to find a place to lay your head most nights. A few others had wandered over to see who Carter was talking to, and they traded some food for the sandwiches as well. I ended up giving away a few of them, and as the afternoon stretched on, they all decided to migrate somewhere to find warmth for the night. I told them good night, meaning to find my own place to sleep, but Carter called my name before they left the park and asked if I was coming. "There's always room for one more around the fire," he said. I spent that night sitting in an alley that was in the middle of a 4-way intersection of buildings. It cut the wind nicely, and someone had secured a tarp to keep the snow off of us. The barrels here had coals burning in them, and the people who stayed here had created a kind of oasis in the swirling snow. It's not much, but it's better than nothing, Carter said. I spent the evening in the company of other cast-offs, laughing and sharing food around as we warmed ourselves by the fires that glowed throughout the night. Someone had a guitar, other people told stories. I fell asleep against a wall in the best shape I'd been in for the last 5 days. I wished I had known these people from the start, and wished I had found a place from the very first day. But I was introspective enough to know that I would have insulted them at the start of this strange journey. This was a place I had come to naturally, a state of mind I had reached on my own, and as I slipped into a blissful slumber, I hoped it wouldn't simply disappear when I woke up, like some kind of dream. I wish it had now. The alternative was a lot worse. I woke up to the sounds of people yelling and running. One of the barrels had been turned over, the coals making smoke as they tried to catch a sleeping bag on fire. People were screaming, scooping up what they could as people moved in the dancing shadows with purpose. I shivered beneath my blanket, certain we were being attacked by demons, but as the shapes got closer, I saw they were police officers. They had discovered our camp, and now they were taking away our one refuge from the cold. I sat as still as I could, trying to be unseen, and when they moved away, I made a break for the nearest alley. I saw flashing lights and heard someone yell at me, but I just kept kicking up snow as I ran for my life. The sun was turning the horizon a hopeful pink, but I just kept moving. When people got in my way, I went around them. When bus stops or stoops rose up to block me, I moved around them too. I didn't dare stop until the sun beat down on my neck, and only then, it was because I just couldn't go anymore. My legs were tired, my head spinning from overexertion, and when I flopped down onto the bench in a bus shell, I was out of breath. I kept trying to make sense of what had happened, but it just wouldn't mesh in my brain. Why had they come after us? We weren't hurting anyone. We were just looking for a warm place to gather. They had come in like we were terrorists, and I hoped that Carter and some of the others that I had met had made it away. I didn't know how long I sat there, but as my stomach started to growl, I knew I would need food. I thought I might put out my hat and try to get some money. The longer I sat there with my eyes closed, the more I wondered what the point was. The oasis now felt like a dirty trick. They'd allowed me a moment of happiness so they could pull the rug out from under me, just as I thought I might have found something better. I almost preferred the uncertainty of not knowing what to expect. As the day passed, I continued to sit on the cold metal bench. What was the point after all? If everything could change in a second, if all safety was an illusion, then why do anything? Enjoying your new life, Alicia? I jumped, realizing someone had sat down next to me. I opened my eyes and realized it was me. I looked exactly the same as I always did in the mirror, but I realized that it had to be the old man, pretending to be me. As I sat here, day had become night, and just like that, we had passed 7 days. I'd done it, had weathered the storm, and I like to hope I was a better person for it. Just basking in my newfound sense of understanding, I answered, realizing it was true. I took the grubby coin out of my pocket and held it in my hand, finding a strange warmth coming from it as we sat in the chill. Well, you made it, and a deal is a deal. What will you wish for, now that you have all this knowledge? I put the coin in his hand, feeling the warmth transfer between us. I want the means to make sure no one else has to live like this. I want to help people, even if it's just in this town. Is that too vague? He closed his hand around the coin, and I felt that warmth radiate through my stomach. I can work with that. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was me again. I was sitting there as if waiting for a bus, and when I got up, I knew what I had to do. It was hard starting out, but the backers came, And as the money came, I slowly fed them. Slowly, I brought them off the street and gave them a place to stay. A decade ago, I took a coin from a beggar. Today, I own one of the largest shelters in the city. There are no confusing forms, no prerequisites, no red tape. We feed those who are hungry. We house those in need. And when I see the hope in their eyes, I know my wish has come true. I think that'll just about do it for us today. But I do hope to see you tomorrow for more cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. Until then, spend some time with your families this year. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. And if, for whatever reason, you no longer speak to your family, enjoy time with those around you, those you hold near and dear, and those that you love. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.